Israel is engaging in what the International Crisis Group is calling an experiment, an attempt to indefinitely maintain Gaza's population below the famine threshold while turning food into a weapon of war.
Well, what other choice do you have? Would you rather die a coward by the bullet, or do you want to die a man, basically carrying the gun?
Sudan is also facing a famine. And in terms of sheer numbers, it's the biggest man-made famine in the world today.
Either you choose the militias that has killed you, or you choose the army that has formed that militia and will also kill you. It is your duty as an anti-imperialist to take it seriously. It is your duty to take the emergency response room seriously, because they are not simply a bandage on a bleeding state or a civil war that's happening. They are the lifeline of a revolution that is yet not done.
Welcome to Decolonial Dispatch, your go-to podcast for global affairs, where we highlight the often most neglected stories happening today from an anti-colonial perspective. In today's episode, we'll be covering revolutionary mutual aid in Gaza and Sudan. We'll also look at the horrific situations of mass starvation in both areas. To explore Sudan in particular, we will be joined by Lina Dohia, a Sudanese writer and analyst based in London, for an exclusive interview on why famine in Sudan is part and parcel of a broader war against the Sudanese Revolution. So stay tuned. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe, like, and share so we can keep on growing this channel. I'd also like to invite you to explore our Decolonial encyclopedia on our website. If you're interested in writing for it, please don't hesitate to reach out. So let's talk about mutual aid in the liberation struggles of the Sudanese and Palestinian people, and starvation as a colonial weapon of war. Now, of course, when we're looking at what's happening in Sudan and Palestine, things seem bleak. But we should also pay homage to the incredible revolutionary initiatives to feed the people in Sudan and Gaza when the entire international humanitarian system has collapsed in the face of genocide. And because that system is actually part and parcel of genocide, in fact, it's probably more accurate to say that the humanitarian international system has been dismantled, as the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation shows us. So let's start there, because solidarity is a far more productive attitude than charity and sympathy when it comes to supporting liberation movement. Now, I know that the empire's brutality outstrips our ability to understand it, that they engage in multiple atrocities instead of one, so we can't keep up, and so that eventually we disengage out of compassion fatigue. Because they're not only trying to kill our people, but they're trying to kill our capacity to recognize an emergency when we see one. They're trying to overwhelm us with their brutality so that it becomes normalized and we become desensitized. And that's why we should start from thinking about mutual aid, because we're not powerless. Mutual aid is that thing that all species do in the face of crisis. They cooperate and share resources. That's our human nature. We don't do it for someone, but for ourselves. And let me say why I think mutual aid is revolutionary. Mutual aid should be distinguished from the disinterested and apolitical field of humanitarian aid. And the reason for that is simple. Whereas humanitarian aid requires the goodwill of states and governments, the very same states which enact genocide, like Israel, mutual aid is when we take care of each other despite governments, militias, and gangs wanting to see our people starve and die. Humanitarian aid asks states for permission. Mutual aid is when the community takes control of their own survival, no permission necessary. Mutual aid initiatives often emerge when the humanitarian aid system fails, when food trucks and food aid delivery are restricted, when markets have collapsed and the black market takes over, when basic food is too expensive, and when people find themselves under conditions of horrific bombardment, looting, and they find themselves in the face of marauding gangs. In a word, where the state retreats, mutual aid comes in. In Gaza, this is exactly what distinguishes something like the Samir Project from not only from the UN, but also the genocidal starvation experiment being conducted by the US-led so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. So who are the Samir Project? It's a mutual aid project that has raised millions of dollars and coordinates with activists and individuals on the ground to bring food, medicine, and emergency supplies to people in Gaza. Israel probably thought that they were just killing a number, because that is how Israel sees Palestinians in Gaza. Numbers and, as one official put it, human animals. So Israel probably thought that when they murdered Hala Sabah's uncle, Samir, in Gaza, that he was just a number. But his death was not just a memory, but a catalyst. Hala Sabah, Lina Doria, and the anonymous activist who runs the Instagram page Translating Palestine came together to found the Samir Project in honor of her uncle. And they have since shown that when the people come together, they can even put international NGOs to shame. The Samir Project is one of many mutual aid groups which have emerged in this way all across Gaza. Collectively, these groups have raised millions from decent people all across the world, even as big capitalists like PayPal and GoFundMe have tried to block this money. And they have often succeeded where the state fails. We all know that there has been a genocide since October 2023 and before that. And if you don't believe that, then take it up with the UN, the ICC, the ICJ, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and virtually every genocide scholar of repute. But we have to focus on the details. Throughout this genocide, Israel has imposed 3 separate total blockades, each about 90 days, that has prevented food from coming in. The last one threatened to make the kind of total starvation we're seeing now happen even quicker. But with international pressure, Israel and the US were forced to allow tiny bits of aid to come through, and they created the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And now, through the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, Israel is engaging in what the International Crisis Group is calling an experiment. Open quote, "The world, it seems, is witnessing an experiment. An attempt to indefinitely maintain Gaza's population below the famine threshold while turning food into a weapon of war," close quote. Israel's banned the UN from doing its job. It's replaced 400 formerly UN-administered aid distribution sites with only 4. And in such situations, mutual aid in Gaza is obviously complicated. Whereas in Sudan, the starving have turned to eating plants and weeds. In Gaza, Israel controls everything that goes in and out and has destroyed arable land and the ability for people to feed themselves. That's what's led Alex de Waal, an expert on humanitarian aid for over 40 years, to say that what he's seeing in Israel is the most meticulously calculated and planned famine anybody has ever seen since colonial times. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is part and parcel of a broader plan of ethnic cleansing. I'm speaking to you in July 2025, one of the deadliest months since the genocide began. According to The Guardian, Israel has killed 1 person every 12 minutes in July, most of them trying to get food. As we were researching this, we had already crossed the threshold where Palestinian adults and babies have been dying daily out of starvation. If we look at the most conservative figures, 60,000 have been killed. The majority of Gazans are confined to very small strips of land where they are being prepared for forced deportation. 70% of Gaza is destroyed. According to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, a new bloc in the Knesset, which is the legislative body of Israel, has just been formed called Riviera in Gaza, which seeks to expedite what they call the Gamliel Trump plan to expel everyone from Gaza and turn it into a tourist resort for capitalist profit. The Gamliel plan is a new add-on. It used to just be called the Trump plan. The current fascist science and technology minister of Israel, Gila Gamliel, has created an AI video with images of herself strolling through a Gaza promenade. Israeli settlers are also backing the plan, and property developers are already advertising land for rentier capitalists to invest in. It's more accurately called the Trump plan, because it was in many ways his idea. Although the plan to ethnically cleanse the strip is one with decades of history. Trump has on the record said he wants Gaza to become a Riviera of the Middle East, where he and his capitalist comrades can make lots of money. We've also learned that at the time of this research, Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of the UK, butcher of Afghanistan and Iraq, also wants in. This is also based on a report by Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, reportedly calling the planned ethnic cleansing a once-in-a-century opportunity. The Tony Blair Institute reportedly suggested that if the Israeli Trump plan was to go through and 500,000 Palestinians were expelled from Gaza, the Tony Blair Institute could help the Israelis build artificial islands, a new port, and a special economic zone. This is one of the many organizations that want to profit from forced deportation and ethnic cleansing. And they want to be involved in the logistics of that project. They want to be involved in and profit from a Gaza without any Palestinians. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which has been consulted by the Boston Consulting Group, pays former US soldiers far more money than they can fill their bellies with, while at the same time they administer and keep Palestinians starving. This is the broader context that explains the famine in Gaza. Israel wants to get people to the south and to the coasts to expel them, and is using food as bait in these traps, death traps. And as for the rest of the strip, it's been turned into no-go zones. The cities have been destroyed, as have the hospitals. As I said before, the UN aid distribution systems of 400 food collection points have been dismantled and replaced by 4. The US military contractors open up these food sites, according to forensic architecture, for roughly only 20 minutes. People come, trying to get their food, and throughout this process, more than 1,000 people in the last few months alone have been killed trying to get to these aid distribution sites. And as starving Palestinians struggle to get food, they're shot by these American well-paid mercenaries. Mutual aid, although far smaller and much less resourced, brings food to some people. But it's not easy in these circumstances. The emergency response rooms in Sudan, which we will get to in a second, and the Samir Project in Gaza, are often also struggling with armed gangs hired by their enemies to disrupt their work. In Gaza, these are gangs which have been armed and supplied by Netanyahu to terrorize people seeking aid. And that's not me saying that, that's the Israeli press. In Sudan, both warring parties have attacked emergency response rooms activists and disappeared them by accusing them of being sympathetic to the other side. And this brings me to the emergency response rooms. Sudan is also facing a famine. And in terms of sheer numbers, it's the biggest man-made famine in the world today. You might know either a lot or a little about Sudan, that there is a war going on, and that throughout history and even now, there have been and are multiple overlapping genocides in the country. But what I found people know less of is that what is happening is a counter-revolutionary war by two wings of the same corrupt, money-grubbing military establishment. And it is a war against the Sudanese Revolution. The emergency response rooms are not therefore just mutual aid organizations, but they are organs of the Sudanese Revolution. They are what's left of the Sudanese Revolution. A revolution committed to nothing except an unconditional loyalty to the Sudanese people. And so you might be wondering, who are the emergency response rooms? They emerged a mere hours after the war between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces in Sudan inaugurated the Sudanese Civil War. The scholar and analyst Mohammed Elnaiem Lina writes in a pamphlet by the MENA Solidarity Network that the ethos of the emergency response rooms were connected to the recent political struggles in the country. That's to say that they come from the same political tradition as those of the resistance committees, the defining revolutionary force in Sudan's December 2018 revolution that overthrew the dictatorship of Umar al-Bashir. These were like neighborhood councils. They mushroomed all across the country and were heavily inspired by the socialist traditions of Sudan, although they transcended party affiliations. The resistance committees were organized on the neighborhood level and were largely responsible for mutual aid, barricades, and organizing their own communities throughout the revolution. But when the civilian leadership, which the resistance committees brought to power, collaborated with the military, with the aid of the US-led so-called international community and multilateral institutions like the IMF, the resistance committees were forced into a position where they had to go beyond just being an appendage to the struggle for democracy in Sudan. On the one side, yes, they tried to prevent what eventually transpired in 2021, which was a coup against the civilian side of a disastrous civilian-military partnership in 2019. Yes, the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces, the ones who are now fighting, worked hand in hand in that coup. But eventually, the resistance committees blossomed into the primary voice of the revolution. They had a radical slogan: no partnership, no negotiations, and no legitimacy. to the enemies of the revolution, the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces. And in another one of their chant, it says, "The revolution is a people's revolution. All power to the people. The army must be confined to their barracks and the RSF must be liquidated." The resistance committees even wrote political charters calling for power to be taken by communes and dissident trade unions. And mind you, this was the result of over 8,000 committees all across the country discussing and debating the path forward for a demilitarized and liberated Sudan. As much as the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese armed forces hate each other today, one thing they have in common is their hatred of people's power, because it represents everything the military regime hated: the power to expropriate from the tiny elite who stole all of the country's resources behind the barrel of the gun, and the power to give power back to the people. Although many lower-ranked soldiers among the army were sympathetic to the revolution, the generals of the Sudanese armed forces and the entirety of the Rapid Support Forces opposed the revolution. Collectively, they killed many of our martyrs. And so when these two forces turned on each other, when the RSF failed in a coup attempt, when the era of the burned tires and the barricades came to an end and the era of the gun emerged, as General Burhan of the Sudanese armed forces recently said while taunting revolutionaries, the revolutionaries were left mainly with two options. Some of them decided to tactically join the army to fight the RSF, the very same army which created the RSF. But others went and formed emergency response rooms. Today, the emergency response rooms run food provision, communal kitchens, children's centers, electricity maintenance teams, women's centers, psychosocial support centers. Not all emergency response rooms came out of the resistance committees, but most resistance committees joined this broader political project. Just like the mutual aid groups in Gaza, many rely on grassroots donations from people like you and me. There's something that needs to be understood about these emergency response rooms. These aren't alternatives to humanitarian aid. They're part of a political project. To return to Muzen al-Nil, open quote, "Recognizing the work of emergency response rooms as the political project it truly is also equips them with the analytical tools necessary to resist co-option by armed groups, civilian factions of the so-called ruling class, the so-called international community, as in Western NGOs and government bodies, and other counter-revolutionary forces." But like in Gaza, they're also operating in a context of a man-made famine. In the case of Sudan, this is a famine where more than half of the country's 45 million people are in urgent need of food right now. The vast majority of them are residing in territory either besieged or overrun by the Rapid Support Forces. And so it's obvious in Gaza why the famine is man-made, but you might want to know how it is in Sudan. In the case of the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, the answer is very straightforward. They loot, they strip cities and countryside of food and resources, they have neither the skills nor expertise to govern cities, they massacre, they plunder, they take over wet water reservoirs and destroy hospitals. That's all they do, sponsored, of course, by the United Arab Emirates. And despite efforts by Kenya and treacherous political elites to create a veneer of legitimacy under a body called Ta'sis, which claims to be launching a parallel government led by the RSF soon, the RSF are just marauding animals who make life miserable for the vast majority of Sudanese people who've had the misfortune of coming into contact with them. But what about the army? Well, this is a bit more insidious. It's true that many in Sudan would far rather live under army rule than the RSF. And when the army comes to a town, the Sudanese do celebrate. Yet that's also partially because the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, has the ability to make sure aid enters into RSF-held territory as the internationally recognized government in Port Sudan. And it refuses to allow aid to enter into RSF-held territory because this, in their rationale, would replenish the RSF. And so an example of this is famine denial. The leadership of the SAF and its government in Port Sudan have denied and prevented any formal declaration of famine because this would cause international pressure to allow aid to enter RSF-controlled territories. The problem here is that 90% of Sudan's starving population are in RSF territory. So deprived of aid, of course, once the army comes in, they get access to aid. The UN has said that the situation for them is catastrophic. As one scholar has put it, The Sudanese army believes that by forcing starvation in RSF areas, it can destroy the group's base. The theory is that RSF fighters will turn on their commanders. It's scaringly similar rhetoric to Tel Aviv. And the SAF has also turned its rhetoric against the UN, saying that they're trying to prolong the RSF's existence by making up a situation of famine. Again, this is another familiar explanation. At the end of the day, it bears remembering that Sudan is a rentier state that is rewarded by imperialism. In Sudan, like countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, we're talking about a zero-sum political environment where the primary motivation for political and military actors is the capture of the state and all of the revenue streams. That's because in Sudan, the ruling elite gets their money from rent, the control of a resource like gold or oil. And in an imperialist world order, that's how you get money if you live in an extractive economy. So the ultimate prize is the state. You get the state, you get oil. You can sell to big powers like the US or China. And today, as oil becomes less important and metals become more important globally, if you get gold, you can sell it to benefactors like the UAE, who will give you money for weapons. This is a war born from and sustained by rentier interests. The old elite, the Kazan, controlled oil. Groups like the RSF get their money from gold. The war in Sudan today, then, is not a clash of ideologies or a struggle for the nation's soul. At its core, it's a violent business dispute between two rival criminal enterprises that have captured and cannibalized the Sudanese state. Both the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces are vast military, economic corporations, each controlling a sprawling empire of companies, resources, and illicit networks. So when the Sudanese armed forces demanded that the RSF be absorbed into it, a business merger, if you will, the RSF tried to overthrow them. Otherwise, both sides were besties. Both sides were against the revolution. Their war is a competition to determine which network will achieve ultimate control over Sudan's rent-generating assets. Rent, by the way, means that you gain money from your exclusive ownership over a resource. That's why the Sudanese scholar Nisreen Al-Amin calls this war a counter-revolutionary war against civilians, because the 2018 revolution would have changed the colonial extractive system. And foreign actors like the UAE, which supports RSF terrorism, would have not gotten easy access to Sudan's resources that nature has gifted to Sudan, but not their country. The UAE's motivation to support the RSF is a similar logic of trying to turn Gaza into a Riviera of the Middle East. It's about business opportunities. It's about resources and getting rid of those pesky humans who are in the way. So yes, when looking at international affairs, never fail to identify your comrades on the ground and make sure that you always help them in their revolutionary struggles to overthrow their oppressor. It's good to start from solidarity, not sympathy. People aren't passive victims. They're active agents of revolutionary struggle. That of course doesn't mean that we forget the incredibly difficult situations they face. And in this particular context, in both Gaza and Sudan, we're talking about man-made famines. Now we're going to get into a deeper treatment of what's happening in Sudan. And for that reason, we're joined by Lina Dohia. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So we heard a bit about the crisis in Sudan. Do you want to explain why we would call this a counter-revolutionary war?
For similar reasons and in extension of what you were speaking about, Mohammed, the war right now is counter-revolutionary because of the conditions that have sustained that war and led it to happen, the conditions of that war itself, as well as the impacts that it has on the Sudanese populace. The conditions being that this is not and should not be analyzed as a war that is just another civil war. There's no such thing as another civil war, but for it to be analyzed as a war between two actors that are plundering over resources and fighting over rule of Sudan and just stop the analysis there conceals a lot more than it actually reveals. So what Sudan has become over the last decades post-colonially is a war economy. Capitalism, as it manifests itself in the periphery, is stripped to its primitive bare, right? Where capital is at its very bare is not, everything's commodified. Everything is up for grabs in order to be exchanged and traded similarly to the way we exchange and trade commodities as commodities here in the West. And that includes people's bodies. And that includes trade routes. That includes security. That includes healthcare. That includes minerals. everything is to be commodified. So in the past decades, when what has been happening is what the scholar Megdi Ghezuli terms a accumulation via rural militia, whereby after decades of austerity, of deregulation, of uneven development, a large section of the population, mostly young men, have been rendered as excess in the capitalist forms. They are a superfluous labor that is not to be included within the formal economy, especially as it implodes.
That's right.
So then these young men are left with no choice to provide for themselves, to provide for their family, but to be part of this war economy. That is how the RSF has come to be, with its predecessor, the Janjaweed, and now during the Darfur genocide and the ongoing genocide right now in Darfur regions and Kordofan. And what we end up having is a situation where you have no choice but to take up arms. You have no choice but to either join either party, whether it's the RSF or the SAF, or you could join or try to access the emergency response rooms. That is, if you get to actually access the emergency response room at all. And the reason why it's counter-revolutionary is because that is exactly what the two parties, even though, as you mentioned before, they are staunch enemies, they were once one of the fiercest allies, that is what they want to happen. They have surfaced that condition to enclose the entire country, where everything is militarized, everything is commodified, and there is no choice for anyone but to take arms or to die. And that runs counter to revolutionary ethos for the basic reasons that we can clearly see. If you die, you are not alive to revolt.
That's right.
If you are starving, you are not well enough to revolt. If you are sick and have no access to healthcare, you have no way to revolt. You have no way to organize. You have no way to mobilize. And that is exactly what they fear. When the RSF, you've highlighted very clearly how they are able to do that. But I think SAF, the army, gets much less credit for their role in the counter-revolutionary tactics that they have carried. They have turned people away from safe havens, people who have been fleeing from violent areas of the war, who are seeking shelter. They have completely neglected any sort of provision for or the basic provisions of a state, so whether it be healthcare or shelter or housing or education or whatever it would be, and just expecting people to get on and using the rhetoric of we are at war and a constant state of emergency to legitimize such cases. They have also started their own recruitment strategy similar to the RSF, whereas the RSF is much more brutally gun to head. The SAF is using the rhetoric of, well, what other choice do you have? Would you rather die a coward by the bullet, or do you want to die a man, basically carrying the gun? And in that case, a lot of people are just left with no choice whatsoever. And another reason why it's counter-revolutionary is exactly also what you've mentioned, is the wanton attack on emergency response rooms. Day after day, week after week, since the war started in April 2023, we have heard and seen of emergency response activists, who are elders from the resistance committees themselves, who have either been abducted or have been murdered or jailed under dubious accounts or dubious charges. And the charge is the same. Each side is charging them or accusing them of working for the other side. That is counter-revolutionary, because the very lifeline that's allowing for people to live long enough to see an end of a war and then therefore a revolution, that revolutionary line is being attacked at its jugular by both the army and the RSF. So in many cases, what is happening right now in the counter to the revolution is that both RSF and the army are engaging in this battle to ensure a fascist militaristic regime reigns, where endless extractivism and endless accumulation continues, regardless of who is victorious.
That's right. And I mean, one of the things that people tend to think is because it's an army versus a militia. Mm-hmm. So the idea among many Sudanese people, even though if you go back during colonial times, you look at the origins of the Sudanese armed forces, it was created as a militia by the British to put down anti-colonial revolts. And in many ways, also the Sudanese armed forces empowered the rapid support forces and even gave them access to their gold rents. Mm-hmm. People still think that, look, I was driven out of my home. I can never go back again. The army is more humane. We should pick the side of the army over the rapid support forces. I want you to maybe help me think a little bit about, and I will say also there's another opposite side. I mean, we talked about this group called Ta'sis, which broke away from Tamarrud. Tamarrud was a kind of civilian coalition of people who claimed to be against the war, for many of them associated with the civilian transition government that was in partnership with the Sudanese armed forces. And Ta'sis broke away to actually create a government under the support of Ruto in Kenya, who's obviously shooting at his own people right now as we speak in Kenya, to create a kind of civilian veneer and a civilian government for the rapid support forces. And there's been many people who also say that because they hate the old elite so much, the Muslim Brotherhood, etc., that we should support that. And then you have another kind of polarization, which is much more popular. We should support the army, including people who, for example, used to support the revolution. I find this to be really kind of fallacious line of reasoning. It's a fallacy. But I wanted to know what you think about that, like this kind of polarization. And I guess the even bigger question for me is, what about a third path, which is reigniting the Sudanese Revolution of 2018?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's a fallacious line of reasoning. I also think that in the midst of all of this politicking that happens with factions breaking away from other factions and splinters claiming to have legitimacy or claiming to have the answer for this war, and really trying to hoard as much answers or kind of insurance policy for themselves, depending on who the winner is, I get lost. I get not only lost, but I get tired as well, because if you are someone with the conviction that you are with the people and of the Sudanese Revolution, and your eye is on the ground for what emergency response rooms are doing, for eye on the ground on what the army, the crimes that the army is committing, as well as what the RSF is committing, then you are able to see through the noise, and you're able to see that all of this is a distraction. It's kind of how I see it. It's a distraction from the fact that we once did have a revolution and the nucleus of power was on the streets. That's another thing about why resistance committees were so revolutionary and they provide such an instructive force of how to resist for all leftist movements worldwide, is that they refuse to negotiate. They refuse to enter these normative spheres of negotiation and of compromise and of entering, I'll give you this if you give me that. They stayed by the barracks. It's like power to the street or nothing. And that's what allowed the revolution to not be co-opted by this liberal elite or reactionary elite outright, to take over it and to turn it into something else for their own individual benefits. And this is what we're seeing right now. The war has completely eradicated all these institutions that we once had, not just institutions, but movements really that we once had, and the memory. It really did eradicate the memory and eradicated people's sense of the future, sense of an imagination of what it looks like when this war ends, because all wars end. There's an idea that once it ends, it's just going to be everyone returning back to their homes and us rebuilding this Sudan, and then we're going to get back to it. And I see a completely different future for Sudanese people once they come back, especially for their emergency response room volunteers who've been there the entire time, in order to reignite that kind of memory. And in a way, to answer your question, I see it as a black and white, like extreme that is provided for the people, where either you choose the militias that has killed you, or you choose the army that has formed that militia and will also kill you. And that's difficult to remember in a state of war. And that is the purpose of the war. And that is the ideologically counter-revolutionary element of the war that I think is not talked about enough.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, like, from the people that I know who were liberal activists, you know, the amount of some of them who have just, like, uncritically adopted this line, which is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, even if that means that the rapid support forces, who are absolutely just have put us through so much trauma, have attacked us viciously, right? Like there's, give a trigger warning on sexual violence, but one of the more famous stories was the amount of women who and trigger warning also on self-harm, and the amount of women who killed themselves to stop themselves from being raped by the rapid support forces, and this kind of stratum of elite politicians who deny these crimes on the one side, and then on the other side you've got this other section of the elite, including people who were for example, even associated with the transitional government, who say that if you even dare say that there's anything wrong with the Sudanese armed forces, you're on the side of the RSF because you're engaging in false equivalence, you're engaging in, you're complicit with narratives which prevent us from defeating and liquidating the RSF. And for me, like the slogans of the revolution, which is that the army should go to the barracks. They have no business making their own government or whatever, calling themselves the president or whatever. Just go back to the barracks, and the RSF should be dissolved totally. You know, that's the kind of wisdom which seems lost today. And I don't know, like, how do you think, you know, me and you and many of us, many people who have been silenced by war, right? People who are against the militarization of society, people who don't want Sudan to be like the Democratic Republic of Congo, locked into this situation where we're just providing resources for people and is a place where militias reign and civilians, you know, people like us, you know, we don't accept this. Yeah. But how can we find a voice again and get back on track with advancing the cause of the Sudanese revolution? Also considering that many of us are outside of Sudan, and many people are in exile in Uganda and in Cairo. Many have come here to Europe. What do you think is the way out of this kind of mess and this forgetting that you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, the antithesis of forgetting is remembering. I mean, this is on like the ideological side. I think it's remembering the martyrs. But I'm not saying this in kind of like a romanticized sense of like, let's remember our martyrs and carrying with them. It literally is remember how many people were shot, were killed, were maimed and violated during the entirety of the revolution since 2018 up until, continuous on with the war. It's remembering that this very army were indistinguishable from the RSF not so long ago, that they were the committers of the Khartoum massacre that happened and those other massacres that have targeted all the barracks and all the revolutionary activity that's happening across the country. It's also highlighting the crimes of the army. It's when it comes to I am speaking to a specific milieu that has past revolutionaries or past liberals who are anti-state or anti-military activists who are there on the ground and outside, who suddenly have found themselves cornered with either the RSF and the army, and then thinking, well, we are one army and one nation, and that's the only way we're going to get our country back. Well, the only way we're going to get our country back is if we're not governed by a military rule. The only way we're going to get our country back is if we open our eyes and have a sense of opacity to see that the difference between a militia and a military and a state military is that one has a state behind it. That's it, right. In terms of anything. But by all it means, you were correct in your intro when you described both of them as they are two businessmen that are fighting over the resources and over the merger or acquisitions of how this corporation and the number of the conglomerate and the corporation that they are in control of is going to be managed. That is exactly what the RSF is. The RSF is a private mercenary force that is up for hire. It's up for hire for Saudi Arabia and the UAE to fight their wars in Yemen, or it's up for hire for the EU in order to act as their externalized border police. And the Sudanese army will be exactly that. It will be no different if the army were to succeed, if the army were to come out victorious out of this. What is going to happen is that the RSF is going to leave a vacuum of smuggled gold, trade routes, of opportunities and resources to plunder that the army is not above carrying or taking up in order to, and again, they will use the excuse of rebuilding the country.
That's right.
I think what is happening right now is that every revolution has a right-wing turn and every war has a right-wing turn. I think a lot about the right-wing turn of this war. I think a lot about the fear that once this war ends, the politics of fear that is going to happen. When the word da'ama, which means like rapid support, RSF support, it becomes a slur that is going to be used and accused for anyone, regardless of whether they are supporters of the RSF or not. I think about how the Sudanese people, once they come back and return back into their homes, are going to still be facing the same exact conditions that they've left, and even worse during the war. And then they're going to have to compromise on their politics even further. We just experienced the war. We'd rather do anything than experience that again, and then blaming the revolution.
And that's what worries me the most.
Yeah.
If the revolution doesn't win, right, we have to win, because if we don't win, what will happen is, the easiest idea for people is to say, forget all this revolutionary stuff. Just accept that the people with the guns are the ones who have power, and keep your head down. And we are people who have a long and vibrant revolutionary tradition. And we have a duty to maintain that revolutionary tradition. If the triumph of either of these warring parties happens, and that there isn't organized revolutionaries who are ready to say, we neither accept the rule of the militia, we neither accept military rule, and we also don't accept these politicians which the West props up as the rational ones, while we're, the idealistic youth and deserve capacity building training because, the politically inexperienced, right? If the charters of people's power, if the revolutionary councils don't triumph, that will be the end of Sudan as we know it.
Yes.
And so, I guess for me, one of the things that I think a lot of people will be listening to this, it might be the first time they're hearing a lot of these ideas. A lot of people have become anti-imperialists. A lot of people are anti-imperialists. It's very obvious for people to see the disgusting nature of imperialism and colonialism when they look at the genocide in Gaza and the ways in which the governments here are almost conspiring to make it illegal to even say anything about it, to anything about it. But the kinds of imperialism we're dealing with, for example, in the DRC, with the interference of countries like Uganda and Rwanda, or in the case of Sudan, in the countries like the United Arab Emirates and Egypt and various other powers, Russia, etc., is that it's not easy to translate that to people to try to understand anti-imperialism. So I guess kind of the last question I'd like to ask you is, what is imperialism in Sudan? Imperialism in these other different countries, and how do we build an anti-imperialist movement that is open to also fighting against the kinds of imperialisms we're seeing in the DRC, in Sudan, etc.? Yeah.
So Sudan, in its own case, has been under U.S. sanctions for decades under the Bashir regime, especially since the 90s until now. So it's been turned into a pariah state that is of very little interest to the West. In direct interest to the West, at least, other than the EU's obvious collaborating with the RSF in order to use them as their external border police. That's it. You are only as useful as what you can provide immediately to the West. As a result, it created a vacuum where other rising, imperially ambitious states, such as the UAE, such as Russia, etc., and Egypt, in many cases, have kind of come in order to plunder and see what is there that's available, and take take forward the sense of imperialism that might not be obvious to a person who's just coming to understand imperialism as it is to be the West versus the rest, or the global North and the global South, or the other kind of frameworks that we use to understand imperialism. So I think imperialism in Sudan is very much that. It is the use of of local actors in order to plunder and then launder that money and that gold and the resources in order for it to land at the hands of the UAE, the biggest benefactor of the RSF and possibly the largest funder of this war, if I'm not mistaken, for them to receive the ultimate to become the ultimate benefactors of this war without having to get their hands dirty at all. I think an anti-imperialist rhetoric or an anti-imperialist framework for us to understand places like Sudan, like Congo, is going to require us to expand our lexicon and our vocabulary beyond the traditional, the West versus the rest of the world imperialism. Whereas the West absolutely sits by idly and does absolutely nothing when it comes to doing anything about it for what it can do, for holding different actors accountable, both local and international. I think an anti-imperialism that genuinely takes the ethos of anti-imperialism in and of itself seriously. It is one that is able to train itself, develop a way to identify our enemies even when they don't look how they are usually supposed to look or how we are used for them to look.
That's right.
It's not always going to look like a European extractive foreign firm coming in to take over the gold mines in West Sudan. It is actually going to look like the very Sudanese people themselves, the RSF, plundering those resources and then landing in the hands of the sole benefactor of the gold in Sudan, which is the UAE. And then the UAE launders that image even further through art washing, through tourism washing, through various other means of, through outright kind of adversary of challenging the ICJ case, for example, when it is brought forward, through censorship,
through
football, absolutely. There's the cultural elements of it, but also UAE is one of the most vicious enactors of state surveillance ever there is. Some of the most sophisticated state surveillance that there could be is there because they bought it from the Israelis.
That's right.
And they use that, and they are not afraid to use that if there's criticism and if there is any kind of challenge, both local within the UAE and external within outside of the UAE. For them, their reach goes very, very far. So there's, of course, the dark side of the UAE, which we are not aware of, which takes, again, the trained eye to go out and find out more. How are these states, oligarchical states, organized? How do they go about securing their interests? What is the dark side or the more concealed side of these states that we don't get to see because the Western media is much on their side as they are on theirs, and there's a long-held collaboration and an allyship between the UK and the UAE that is difficult to be broken off for them when it comes to it, because, like you said, these are, at the end of the day, businessmen's conglomerates that are there to reap as much profit as possible and leave the rest of the proletariat around the world just like scheming for the rest. So I think an anti-imperialist rhetoric is the one that actually is curious. It's one that is self-reflective, and it is one that takes every revolutionary force and every resistance that there could be, no matter how small or big it is. Seriously.
No matter how inconvenient.
No matter how inconvenient.
To the narrative.
Exactly, how inconvenient it is to the narrative and how unfamiliar it looks like. It is your duty as an anti-imperialist to take it seriously. It is your duty to take the emergency response room seriously, because they are not simply a bandage on a bleeding state or a civil war that's happening. They are the lifeline of a revolution that is yet not done.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's a great way to end. And so I really thank you for that. That's it for this edition of Decolonial Dispatch. Remember, decolonization is not a metaphor. Stay informed and stay engaged. If this report was valuable to you, please do share it with your networks and become a supporter of our work by joining our mailing list. Soon we'll be launching a supporters network website, and you can find more info about this in the description. I'm Mohammed Elnaiem. This is Decolonial Dispatch, and I'll see you next time.